welcome to today's session. This is the essentials for broadcasters and journalists in high-risk context. I'm Richard Ayres. I'm the chair of 7 League. We're a digital sports marketing communications agency. And today, you'll be glad to know you're not going to hear very much from me, but we do have a tremendous panel who I'm just going to introduce in a second. So thank you very much for joining us, all of you who are there online. We will be doing some questions later in the session. And so please do remember to use the chat function if you want to comment about things, or indeed the question tab, and if you want to be able to input into the session. We hope to be able to come to those later on. So our conference, of course, is being hosted by the Centre for Sport and Human Rights. So please do follow online. The sporthumanrights.org is for the website. There's LinkedIn, of course. Twitter, the handle is Sport and Rights. And of course, don't forget to use the conference hashtag if you're into that kind of thing, which would be SCF21. That's #SCF21. So joining us today, we have 4 tremendous experienced people in this area. And it's complicated, and these guys have a tremendous different perspectives. So Gypsy Guillen-Kaiser is the Advocacy and Communications Director at the Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPJ. She's a specialist in advancing structural change to ensure freedom of the press, defend human rights, and secure social and economic justice. Gypsy's worked for 20-odd years with international NGOs and as a journalist. We're also joined by Martin Ziegler. He's the chief sports reporter of the Times and the Sunday Times, focusing on sports governance and the business of sport. And he's covered 6 football World Cups, 5 Olympic Games for the Times and the Press Association, and has reported from more than 30 countries in the past 20 years. So covering stories such as FIFA corruption, Russian doping scandals, and many more. Moira Thompson-Oliver was the head of policy and chief counsel for British Telecom's International Human Rights Programme until February this year. And that saw her serving a 23-year career, leading BT's broadcast role in the mega sporting events platform for human rights, which was the predecessor of the centre. And she spearheaded BT's work on modern slavery and the rule of law, which was shortlisted for the Times Charity Awards and the Financial Times Innovative Law Awards in 2017. In February this year, she joined the Vodafone Group as the human rights lead. And last but not least, Amelia Knott is a human rights consultant. She works with businesses across sectors, including media and construction and food production and development finance. Amelia has, since 2019, been undertaking a program of research for the TV industry Human Rights Forum, exploring aspects of human rights risks involved in TV production and broadcasting specifically. And the aim being to identify gaps that are not currently addressed and to develop practical guidance and tools for those working in TV. So I'll just remind you, there's chat, there's questions, we'll be coming to those afterwards. But my opening question, and Amelia, if I may, I'm going to come to you first on this. We talk about high risk contexts, but what does that actually mean? I mean, what are we defining as high? Because I would imagine one person's high risk is another person's, lower risk, but I'm no expert. You tell me, what have you found?
Well, I've been working on a whole piece of research this year looking at exactly these sorts of questions. And I actually think that high risk isn't a particularly useful definition, because there are lots of contexts that can start low risk and then become high risk. And one of the broadcasters I spoke to as part of the research, they have a particular definition, which is that high risk is where there's an increased likelihood of death or serious injury. But that ignores a whole other range of risks that might occur as well. And if we think about things like the digital realm, the rise of social media, sports broadcasting used to be something that was relatively uncontroversial and safe, but actually anything that you do within the sports world now can lead to increased harassment online. That can become something offline. The risks are totally different. And one of the security advisors that I spoke to as part of the research said the worst situation is where you start with something that is being deemed a 1 in terms of risk profile, really low risk. So there's no proper planning or preparation or resources that's gone into it, and then it escalates suddenly to a 5. So I would actually say that there are essentials that are needed in all contexts, and that's how they should be thought of, rather than just trying to identify those which you might think are the highest risk.
Interesting. Great. Thank you. It's the rate of change that's the problem and the planning around that. Now, Martin, you've been in many, I would imagine, many a high risk environment. What does it mean to you?
Well, I mean, if you look at the covering sports events, I mean, there's such a range of experiences. I mean, covering the Beijing Olympics, where you're obviously very, very closely monitored. And then, for example, the most recent World Cup in Russia, I mean, I had an interesting experience there where I'd got on a train to just not to go and interview the Senegal team at their training base, which is a couple of hours outside of Moscow. And you had to book a train ticket with your passport. That was the only way. And an hour into the journey, the police basically came looking for me because of my passport had gone into the system, obviously raised a flag, and these two officers came and asked me where I was going, what I was doing. It was quite a sort of strange sensation that you feel like you're being monitored, just actually reporting on a sports event.
Yeah. Moira, you've been looking at this for a while. The high risk, does that sort of fit with your experience?
Yeah, it does, and I think it's a combination of both what Amelia and Martin have just said. I think obviously there's risks attached to the operation of broadcasting itself, whether it's to the people that you send to do the broadcast, or risks in relating to other contractors who are working on that event. But I also think you need to take account, as Martin was saying, of the country risk, and I think the key thing here is to actually, as Amelia was saying, is really to anticipate risks in advance, and we can talk about that a bit later. But what you don't want is risk escalating while you're there, and so having tools and guidance to help you think in advance, well, what are the contextual risks that we could be facing in this country from both the broadcast activity or in relation to our people and operations is really important. And I think it is worth saying that the UN last year also put out a report about directed at corporates about heightened due diligence that's required in high risk countries. So there's a lot of tools that are starting to come out online relating to this issue.
That's really interesting. It makes me wonder, 20 years ago, when I was a journalist, they very much had sort of territorial beats. The correspondent for a particular region or a particular area would have that, and as a result, they knew the risk in that. Is part of the challenge here that a sports journalist will actually be working on the sport is their beat, and then suddenly they're across multiple territories and cultures and different sort of risk profiles? Or am I completely misunderstanding how that works?
No, I mean, it's a really good point, but I think the business models have changed. So you might well still have those on the ground, people who are more familiar, but it would depend on what sort of broadcaster you are. So how big you are, whether you have a news arm as well as a sports arm, for example. It also depends on the nature of the broadcast. So, one of the things that I found really eye-opening when I was at BT was actually going to a live broadcast and seeing all the hundreds of people behind the scenes making it work. But it's not always the case that if you broadcast something, that you've actually got a broadcaster there. You might be what's called taking a live feed from another broadcaster. So again, that risk picture changes, and also how you can influence what ends up on the screen can really change depending on that sort of model for that particular broadcast of that specific event.
Gypsy, you've been working around this, the Committee to Protect Journalists. This is your sort of specialist area in that. What's your view on what the other panelists have been talking about?
Yes, a lot of that is actually correct. What I think is important to keep in mind, though, is that risk is highly contextual, but it's also situated. Could be that you're not in a high-risk country, but you may find yourself in a risky situation, depending on the place and time. And essentially, also a journalist experience level can play a role. A situation may be less risky for someone accustomed to navigating hostilities, and more risky for someone who is not accustomed to this. On the mention of beats and sports journalists focusing on the sport, I mean, there are many elements to a sport, right? There might be local teams of children who are preparing for the coming games and who have an emotional link to the games, et cetera, et cetera. And there are conditions perhaps around where those children live, what they what their process is in relation to sports and their access to facilities, et cetera, et cetera. And those things can be considered delicate matters depending on where you're doing the reporting. I mean, we have found that reporting around sports events related to human rights violations, labor abuses, environmental degradation, mass displacement, actually typically increase risk levels. Because these issues affect countries' reputation or a city's reputation and their ability to gain or retain lucrative high-profile events, not just sports, but very broadly. And so some topics carry an inherent risk. And I think most journalists going into certain countries know that. At CPJ, we recommend pre-assignment risk assessments, precisely to determine the level of risk already present in the country. And that means things like the legal environment. I mean, one has to know what is illegal when going into a country, right? So there are things that are more structural like this that can be assessed, and you understand what the operational risks are going in. But certainly it is, as Amelia mentioned, that things can turn very quickly, can escalate. We have found over the past year, for example, that covering protests has become extraordinarily risky for journalists, whereas before it might happen here and there as an incident, but we're seeing that journalists are being attacked at protests. And we're seeing that in relation to COVID, for example, and vaccines. So that's just an example outside of the sport world where this participation of groups in expressing discontent can lead to a risky situation. And that's precisely what Amelia was referring to, where you have to continuously check on risk as you are on assignment covering the issues in a particular country.
Great, that's really interesting. And Amelia, I want to follow up on that in a second. Martin, just coming to you for a moment. What is the practical reality that we're talking about here? That the issues are sort of at a global level around the press freedoms, around the challenges that the journalists are facing. What kind of generally, what kind of things are we talking about here?
I think the challenges are that journalists want to, they want to sort of seek out beyond what the authorities want them to see. So, for example, if you want to go to the World Cup in Qatar, you don't want to just see what's being laid on for you in terms of the migrant worker situation. You actually want to go and speak to migrant workers. You want to see how they live without it being stage managed. The same will absolutely happens in China, in Beijing in 2008 when there were human rights protests before the games. You wanted to go and speak to the people involved there. I mean, it's not just those countries. It's everywhere. Journalists want the freedom to be able to seek out things for themselves. They don't want to be spoon-fed things or stories or issues by the authorities. I think freedom is a really important factor here.
Yeah, that freedom of movement and freedom to interview who you want to interview. Yeah. Amelia, you undoubtedly will have some facts and figures around this.
I'm not sure if they're facts and figures so much as sort of anecdotes and stories, but one of the things that has changed quite a bit is that sports coverage it's increasingly involving smaller teams, and that's a trend that's been accelerated by the pandemic. I mean, we've seen it also with shrinking newsrooms, and broadcasters tend to have fewer people on the ground. And one of the things that means is there's much more reliance on third parties, local media support workers, fixers, translators, drivers, and so on. And a lot of my research also looked at their experiences. And they tend to have far fewer protections. They don't often get things like safety training, insurance, safety equipment, or any other welfare support. And at the same time, there were quite a lot of stories that I was hearing about how international crews interact with local media support workers, that there's often a sense of hierarchy and a culture of us and them, which can increase the safety risk for everybody, actually, if there is that in place. There are risks around cultural insensitivity if people haven't actually taken the time to understand historical context or anything, or talked to their fixers in advance to really understand the local situation that they're going into. That puts everyone at greater risk as well. And all those freelancers themselves are under quite a lot of pressure to take risks that they might not otherwise agree to, because everyone is dependent on word of mouth for the next job. And there's therefore, I mean, that goes alongside that, there's a fear of speaking up and raising concerns. Actually, you really want the people with local knowledge to be challenging you as an international crew going out to broadcast somewhere and say, that's not a good idea, that's not safe, this is a better way of doing it. But if in challenging people, they're then seen as difficult to work with, that's their career on the line. And so that has come out as a pattern, but it's something, I mean, a lot of that actually is within broadcasters' control to mitigate. But that's one of the things, that increased reliance on third parties, on people on the ground, but without the support that everybody else gets. Yeah,
it's really interesting. So Moira, in your view, the broadcasters, I mean, not to blame here, but they're under pressure, right? Is this their stuff to sort out, or is it not theirs? It's the individual journalist, and how do they sort of build that into their broadcast behaviors?
Yeah, I think there is a level of responsibility, but I think I was just reflecting as Amelia was talking about how things have changed post-COVID, and whether actually there is. So the model that I was familiar with when I was at BT was that we were using people as broadcasters either through a production company who we knew and had long-standing relationships with, or other people who we employed ourselves. We weren't as dependent in that way on some of that the sort of more temporary side of things, as Amelia was saying. I think in terms of the guidance and tools, there's definitely a lot of pre-planning that goes into events and into editorial policy and guidelines. But I also think that some of the challenges are around, and I wonder whether, I'm not an expert in journalism, but I wonder whether there is a distinction here to be made between broadcast journalism and print journalism, because there is a regulatory context as well that's really important here, not just in terms of risk to people in terms of health and safety, etc., but I'm also thinking about the regulatory environment of the broadcast itself. And going to Martin's point around the need to sort of reflect, what's happening in the broader context, that there are constraints in a sense around, and it's certainly around impartiality, and when if for example you just have I was mentioning earlier, you might have just a sports broadcast team. If you don't have a news team, then there's also a real sometimes internal challenge as to how much can we reflect this situation that we're seeing on the ground. Is it appropriate and contextual to the sport, or is it something that we would be better off putting through a news channel? And I certainly know that when we were working with, when I was part of the broadcast working group at the Centre for Sport and Human Rights, when we were talking about these issues, this was a real, challenge, that some broadcasts were getting footage of events on the ground and having to think, can we explore this issue better in a news context? And so actually handing it over to different teams rather than the sports team reporting on that event or that issue at the time.
So Martin, just taking those thoughts forward, what occurs to me is you used to have journalists who were exclusively print or exclusively radio and TV once upon a time, and then they all sort of got merged into, I remember going through Bimedia, and then that became Trimedia, and then you have the whole sort of digital side of things. I mean, I'm not asking specifically how this affects you at the Times, but you must have seen across the sector as a whole people who have a sort of a real range of responsibilities in terms of their output. And I just wonder, does that have an impact on the way that risk is dealt with, or the way that people behave in their sort of operational procedures, because they're coming from just a print background, or maybe they're just a digital person who's now doing broadcast? Or do you know what I mean? Does that make any difference at all to how you end up dealing with things on the ground?
I think it does, actually, Richard. I mean, just thinking on my own experience, when the social media age dawned, and then actually the whole digital demands became much greater. When I was working for the Press Association, covering the FIFA corruption stories, and I was in Zurich twice when the police raided the famous Borrelac Hotel, and then actually, so you weren't just, although I was a print journalist, there was also an expectation, which I, in the 20 years previously and not had, that, you were going to be taking photographs. You were using your phone to create moving images. I mean, one of my colleagues is a print journalist for AP, got a really good video of somebody being arrested and put in a police car, which then became one of the defining moments of that story. So yeah, the demands have changed and the expectations have changed. You're not just sitting back and sort of writing a thoughtful chin-stroking piece. You're actually expected to be in at the action with your phone camera, catching things when you can.
Yeah, which if you go from being a print journalist and then you say, well, I'll just get my camera out and start videoing things, that could totally change the reaction in the local environment to how you're treated.
Absolutely.
And yeah, okay, interesting. Moira, did you have anything to comment on that? Obviously, you've seen the journalism profile change and that over the years.
Sorry, I wasn't saying that I've necessarily seen it change. I wasn't close enough to that activity. It was more, I was making the point around the regulatory environment that impacts broadcast journalism. So here in the UK, you have the Ofcom code around impartiality, obviously, but also for respecting fundamental rights as part of that. And so, that all has to be baked into the transmission that goes out. You have to obviously comply with those obligations. And I think that can potentially present some tensions between the sort of situation that Martin was talking about, where you're seeing things and wanting to obviously portray, the reality on the ground, but also, the big challenge with broadcast journalism is obviously it's live, right, most of the time. And so, you're having to make decisions very quickly in compliance with regulation, open to complaint mechanisms afterwards. So there's a whole sort of extra set of considerations that go into what you end up actually broadcasting.
Yeah, and Gypsy, you have seen this developed, as a journalist and also at the CPJ. This point here about, and tell me if it's not a point, but the changing requirements upon broadcasters and journalists, particularly with digital and social, and how that does or doesn't have an impact on how you deal with it and how you treat risk and how you manage that in the field.
I think fundamentally the journalistic mission is the same across, just across, whether you're doing it online or on air or in print, right? Which is to report the news, and the news related to sport is obviously what's happening in the field and with the game and with the athletes, right? If you want to look at it strictly. So certainly, I think in terms of impartiality and ethical standards, that generally applies across the board. I think the situation with broadcasters is obviously there's an infrastructure issue of actually relying on signals and having to broadcast from specific countries where you don't want a blackout because it doesn't work, then you're off, right? So that I think that makes a difference. One thing I wanted to mention is that CPJ actually launched about a year ago, maybe longer, a campaign focused on photojournalists and videographers and their safety. The reason for that being that their equipment makes them very visible, particularly in crowds. And so it's easier for a print journalist to sort of mix in and mingle in a crowd situation, in a hostile environment situation, than it is for a photojournalist or a video operator to do so. They have heavy equipment, very visible, and we have found that it has made them a target. So this is also a factor. The other thing is the confiscation of equipment that happens by hostile authorities. And obviously this happens also to print journalists who may be, as Martin mentioned, carrying their phone around and pulling it out, etc. But the loss is much greater in terms of financial loss and ability to operate for a camera person or a photojournalist. And these are factors to take into account. You can really impact the coverage that that person is able to do and really stop them by taking away that equipment.
Yeah.
And then to speak to something that Amelia mentioned, which I think is important to reiterate because we have it in the data, local journalists pay a much higher price than international correspondents do. That's just a fact. It is they who face the greatest and deepest reprisals. And in some instances, their families may face risk. So this is a very, very important factor to keep in mind for those operating globally, and especially with, as Amelia mentioned, the increased reliance on local staff and local contractors to prepare things in the lead up to an event and to wrap up post-event and to support during an event. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah. So Amelia, what are the things that broadcasters, journalists, can or should be doing to mitigate the risks? So what are the steps?
Well, broadcasters have a whole range of security practices which are in place, which are used to mitigate things in high risk contexts. One thing that I think there needs to be greater focus on is recognizing that security isn't just a mitigation, but can present risks in and of itself. Whether that is public security, whether you're relying on local police to support, or whether it is private security and you're using private security providers. I mean, there have been some awful examples, actually, lots of examples in other sectors where private security has ended up injuring people or killing people. There was an example of news journalists covering a protest last year in Denver who took a guard with them as their security mitigation, and he ended up shooting somebody dead. And actually, there was a failure of vetting and due diligence all the way along the chain. The news team had relied on a very large security provider in the US who hadn't done their checks. They had subcontracted to somebody else, and they'd ended up with an unlicensed security guard who, unknown to anyone, had brought his firearm. And that is a failure at every stage. And interestingly, when I've looked at the news reports on this, everyone has said it wasn't us, it was the fault of the next person in the line. But the human rights lens says that actually they should all have been asking about licenses, training, and so on. So there's quite a bit to do around that. The other really interesting point that came out as a theme of the research, there's a whole load of mitigations that people have. So risk assessments has been mentioned, PPE as last, so vests and helmets and so on, training, hostile environment training. Now, all of these things come from a security landscape that is dominated by men with backgrounds in military, law enforcement, and the intelligence services. And one of the things, the theme that came out of the research is they don't actually deal that well with all those people who don't fit a sort of norm. Women, ethnic minorities, LGBTQ+, people with disabilities. Instead, for things like risk assessments, these get bolted on to the existing risk assessment. And suddenly being a woman or having a disability is an added barrier that gets added on to a risk assessment, rather than fundamentally rethinking the risk assessment process and all the opportunities that are provided by, for example, being a female journalist operating in the Middle East. You can access places that male journalists cannot go. And similarly, the hostile environment training. I've actually done the hostile environment first aid training many years ago, and it's very macho, and it's all about hiding from bombs. And it wasn't actually very useful for the environment that I was going into South Sudan. It wasn't very useful for navigating that environment in the situation that I was in. And I think there is scope for some fundamental rethink around the security industry and how it works with broadcasters, how group security teams, how diverse they are as well, in rethinking how, a much more nuanced approach to thinking through security risks. Just as an example I had last week, I was talking to someone who was proudly telling me about their the online training that they offered and how it had brilliant tips for journalists. For example, you should always sit behind the driver, because when someone wants to shoot you, they'll have to shoot the driver first, and that gives you a chance to get away. And this was said to me sort of, as a really positive example. And I thought, hang on a minute, this is the face of a security industry that centers the individual and doesn't look at the threats that they pose to all the people around them, to that low-paid driver who may be supporting their family and who hasn't signed up to take a bullet for somebody. And yet that is the advice and guidance that is being given to people who travel. And I think that there is a reset that's needed around those security practices.
Well, Martin, you must have had some experience. When you get a young journalist who comes into your team, I mean, I'm sure there's a form to fill in and a certain amount of training they go on, but you probably give them the advice of a man who's been there and sort of done it a bit more. I mean, what do you point them at? Is it security teams? Is it not security teams? Is it local? How do you practically speaking get somebody in that right place?
Yeah, well, we did have training before we went to the World Cup, the Olympics in Brazil, which was quite helpful. But I think actually that's only something that's coming quite late in terms of print journalists. I mean, I certainly remember going to the South Africa World Cup with it without any guidance and stuff like that. So it's very much just try and learn on the job, and if you can pass that on, that's great. But I think it's very much a hit and miss affair. Yeah, and I also think it's quite difficult these hostile environment training things, because each country is so different, isn't it? And what might make sense for somewhere in the Middle East may be completely different to South America, maybe completely different to the Far East, or even parts of Europe. So I think that Amelia's right. There has been a sort of one size fits all approach, and it just doesn't work.
So the other side of this equation, so we have the broadcasters, but of course we have the sport governance side of things, which is something that the centre, very much tries to assist on that side as well. What's being done on that side of it, by the sports governance, or maybe what should be done by the sports governance side of it?
Well, I mean, I was actually going to move on to the whole thing around these sports organisations, and when they organise these major events, I think they quite like the fact that for security reasons, that they actually want to restrict journalists' movement. So for example, for many Olympics that I can remember, the International Olympic Committee have had their members' hotel has had very restricted access. And it's always the argument is always because of security, because they've got royalty and various other important people staying in those hotels. So you're actually limited to where you can get to, so you can't speak to the people when you want to speak to them. FIFA, similar to an extent, although it's not quite as restrictive. It hasn't been in the past anyway. But then you get situations like in Tokyo with the pandemic, where actually your everybody's movement is incredibly restricted. And I actually think the pandemic is an example, a potentially worrying one, where people may think this is an opportunity where they can impose further restrictions on movement without and they have the perfect argument. We don't want you to go here because we don't want to spread COVID. Actually, there may be an underlying reason why that fits in very well with them, and I think it's something we should definitely keep an eye out for these major sporting events in the next few years.
Well, and Moira, coming to you, you may have some thoughts around that, but also I'm wondering about the work that you've been doing around the tools and the processes that have been, that are there. But tell us your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think what I would say is I see things slightly changing as, particularly in the context of companies and businesses broader obligations on human rights. With the advent of the UN guiding principles, I say advent, they were put in place 10 years ago, but I think more companies are now understanding they have a responsibility to respect human rights in their operations, and a part of that involves due diligence. And indeed, we're going to see mandatory, legal measures on that in various countries. Already has happened, more likely to come through. I think what that means is that there will be a more sense of responsibility throughout the value chain. Like Amelia has pointed out some really shocking examples where people were sort of saying it wasn't their responsibility. That will change. People will see that they have a responsibility all the way through. But secondly, I think it will really demonstrate this need that to do pre-planning. And that's something that I'd already seen starting to happen. The Centre for Sport and Human Rights, we developed a tool for broadcasters and sponsors about how to think about some of these issues in advance, so that you're not, if you are constrained in the moment when you're on the ground, there's stuff that you can do in advance, either to sort of mitigate against that or to understand that, and so put other measures in place to try and work with those restrictions, but still do your job. So I think there's a clear space for thinking ahead. The other part of that equation is a really important role for journalists and human rights defenders in advance of broadcasting events, giving that rich context of what's really happening on the ground. And that's, again, something that I've seen the centre convene very successfully to help broadcasters in pre-planning to get that sort of real nuance of the lived experience in that particular country.
So, Gypsy, we've talked about the broadcast side. We've talked about a little around the sports governance side. What's the role that the broadcasters and the media have in engaging with the sports and with the athletes in particular, and around all these kinds of issues?
Well, first of all, I did want to mention something in relation to Martin's point about COVID and the pandemic-related restrictions. CPJ is actually monitoring 10 different types of press freedom violations related to COVID restrictions. And that goes from having journalists expelled from countries or certain areas, to legal action, to actually being detained for covering certain things. So this is definitely an area that pandemic related more broadly beyond COVID that we should be looking at in terms of the future. Now, in regards to the, I'm sorry, your question was about the broadcasters?
Yeah, to what degree do broadcasters and the media need to work with, alongside, engage with the sport and indeed the athletes around this? I mean, so far in this conversation, we've been treating them as sort of two different groups of people tackling the same problem, but I'm just wondering to what degree they come together.
Well, I mean, I think it depends on the context, but essentially you have, I think, a responsibility to report on the realities of the athletes in addition to the country context, etc. I am not sure, however, that athletes have much leeway beyond their own personal circumstances to influence some of these processes. However, what I will say is the sporting bodies are recognizing to some degree that they have human rights due diligence commitments, and that extends not only to the athletes, but also to the journalists, the media that's covering these events. Much of the process for cases that come up around mega sporting events, including suspensions or reprimands, seems to be closed. There are behind-the-scene arbitration measures, and that happen between the major sporting bodies and particular governments. But we need further clarification about those possible preventative or corrective measures and where they are available. Through the IOC, measures can be taken against IOC members, international sporting federations, national Olympic committees, organizing committees, candidate cities, and so on. But there is a lack of transparency in that reporting. And in that sense, I mean, these are things that protect the athletes. As you know, some athletes have become dissidents while they're abroad. So it protects the athletes, but it also can protect the journalists. One of the main problems, there has been a series of grievance mechanisms set up by the various sport bodies. But one of the main problems is really that it's all behind the scenes. We don't really know what happens. We don't know really what to expect. And it could be that, you know, the sports bodies are not really complying with the UN guiding principles. So there's a discrepancy, a huge discrepancy between the standards and the perceived capacity of past grievance mechanisms to provide remedy to journalists and others who have problems during the games. And really, they have to be bodies that journalists know about, that they can trust, and that they can use if they need to. And I would say it's probably a similar situation for athletes that need support.
I'd like to ask all of you really the sense of okay, well, what are those future issues that we're facing? We talked a little bit earlier on about social media and about digital as a journalist. We haven't really talked though about, you know, an athlete and their social media and how easy it is for, you know, either frankly an attendee or an athlete to sort of cross over a barrier where they're accidentally almost reporting on the status of an event, for example. But what are the other kinds of issues, the future issues that we need to be looking out for and addressing? I mean, Amelia, if I may come to you first on that one, and then I'll just come through the group. And then I should remind everybody who's watching, if you've got questions, please do funnel them through. I think we've had a few come through already, and we're dealing with them as we go. But we're going to do a sort of a Q&A session in the last. We've got what, 15 minutes left. So we'll deal with that over the course of the next 10 minutes or so, and do please give us your questions. But Amelia, coming to you, the future issues that we ought to be thinking about.
Actually, I find that quite challenging. I spend a lot of time looking at all the current issues and worrying about those. But I mean, there are, as you say, that the digital realm has widened significantly. I think there's been also sort of generally perceptions of journalists has taken a slide, and that's been reinforced by politicians and their rhetoric around the world, and things are becoming increasingly dangerous, I think, for media, even covering things like sports, which should be joyful occasions, but actually come with all sorts of different risks. I did want to add, though, I think there are real opportunities around sports broadcasting because of the time you have to plan for them. And I want to reiterate Moira's point about the importance of planning and preparation. If you're a news journalist, you might have to respond really quickly and be doing your risk assessment on the fly. There's so many opportunities for with sports to do that advanced planning really well and to set the standard for other styles of journalism, because we know when the sporting events are going to happen. So I'm not sure I've really answered your question about future issues, but I put in a point anyway.
Seeing as I put you on the spot, that was a pretty good first stab. Moira, if you're thinking about those future issues and sort of on the ground change, what are the kinds of things that come to mind?
Yeah, I guess I'd highlight two things. One is I think what we've seen is, you know, an increased the idea of sport exceptionalism, if I can put it that way, that sport is seen apart from you know, the rest of the world in a way. I think that's obviously we've seen that change a lot. I think that's going to continue. The other thing which I think I would like to just mention again, because I think it is an important contextual change, is how human rights obligations for enterprises is going to become, you know, more and more significant, and not just for the big corporates or the big name broadcasters, but for every organization. And I'm going to be really interested to see how that regulatory change will sort of affect some of the risks and issues that we've talked about on the ground.
Yeah, and Martin, what's in your diary? What are the big ones that you're coming up to, the big events, and I guess also which are the ones you're concerned about from a risk point of view?
Well, I think the big events over the next 18 months are are also actually the big human rights events around sport, because and there's the Beijing Winter Olympics is coming up early next year. There's been obviously a huge focus on not there's the issue with the Uyghurs, the treatment of them, and also the crackdown on human rights in Hong Kong and more generally. And then going on to Qatar, which is November next year, where they're hosting the 2022 World Cup. The issue of migrant workers is really a powerful one. That continues to, Amnesty just had a recent report which was raising a lot of concerns there. And actually, it's not just Qatar, but it's other countries across the Gulf in similar situations. So, but I think those two, obviously, they're going to be the main ones from both a sort of mega sporting perspective as well as a human rights perspective.
Yeah, I keep sort of hearing on the grapevine there are a lot of long-term deals being considered, particularly I think in the Middle Eastern area. There's a lot of Qatar, Saudi, those long-term sporting deals, which, I mean, does that make things more challenging from a sort of human rights risk point of view, or the length of the deals, I mean, or actually is that an opportunity for I guess long-term change in the behaviors around that, or the way in which training is done, or those kinds of things? Do you have a feeling on that?
I think it's actually a challenge for the international sports governing bodies, and how much they genuinely want to make human rights as part of their future events, because or whether they're just paying lip service to it. Next year will be a terrific challenge and an opportunity, and we will be able to see from that just how these international sports federations, these huge organizations, just how they are going to tackle this, and whether they are really going to make human rights their priority, or is it just something which is going to be a difficult thing for them to have to deal with.
Yeah, there's a lot going on, isn't there? So Gypsy, this question about the future, the things that we need to see change, that we can see coming down the line, but also those events that are coming up. Any thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, I think we should remember that human rights are not about nagging, pesky NGOs and groups that are unhappy with certain conditions, complaining and creating troubles, right? Ultimately, human rights are about people and about our ability to live freely and with a degree of dignity. So despite the fact that you have all of these legal structures and legislation and guidance and all of these things around the protection of human rights, ultimately it's about you and me and how we treat one another. So I think that's important to keep in mind whenever we speak about these things. It's values, it's people. In terms of the future, I did want to highlight fan harassment as something to keep an eye on, particularly as it affects female journalists. Prior to the World Cup in Brazil, CPJ documented something called Deja ela trabalhar, which is the hashtag let her do her job. It was a movement among female sports reporters in Brazil who protested the online abuse that they receive almost daily, in addition to offline harassment. So I think that's an important aspect to keep an eye on. The also racist violence against some athletes, and that we have seen play out in stadiums, is also something that can manifest against journalists. And so that's another area that is spilling over, but is rather unexplored. And then it's really important to keep an eye on digital crackdowns and surveillance. And there, I'll give you the example of a troubling development in relation to Qatar, which is one of the upcoming events. There's a Kenyan national and labor rights activist in Qatar, Malcolm Bidali, who blogged about his experience and the country's rights record. He was detained for a month and ultimately released and allowed to leave the country after paying a fine. However, the troubling development is that Bidali, after his arrest, it was reported that spyware was used to target him right before his arrest. And this is according to an Associated Press report. There are very few details about this, but the incident should showcase the use of spyware throughout the region. And actually, as we've seen recently through the Pegasus papers reporting, Pegasus project reporting, this is something that's present around the world. So false news and cybercrime laws, in addition to or in combination with the spyware and surveillance that is becoming increasingly pervasive, is also something to look at in the future.
Yeah, I can totally see that. And also just coming from a sort of media technology background, just the rise of that capability and the way it's used is, and how you regulate, or can you regulate? And I'm putting that alongside in my own personal anecdote of, having gone, I was lucky enough to go to the Euro final, although one could say unlucky enough, bearing in mind some of the behavior from some of the fans was horrendous. And on the tube on the way home, three, middle-aged white guys beside me were, the worst bit was they were having a discussion about how to abuse Marcus Rashford on Instagram. It was like a technical social media conversation about the best ways in which you could get the biggest reaction. And I thought, oh, that's a whole nother angle that needs addressing. One last question, and one that's come from the audience in here, specifically about capacity. And I think this is probably one for you, Moira, maybe Amelia as well. What can media companies do to improve their capacity when they're aiming to respond to the risks that are being identified? Moira, start me off.
Yeah, I think, one of the critical things is just not everyone working in silos. I think it's really important that more conversations had. Some of the things that Gypsy's just been saying and you've been saying, Richard, these are really shocking things, which, other perhaps people working in some media companies might not be aware of. So having a forum like the Centre, bringing together people with different perspectives, sort of multi-stakeholder environments, can really help just bring a level of understanding, that because we have to remember that some people might have come into journalism or broadcast journalism. There might be not just be the broadcaster, they might be key people in the compliance team, for example, or the risk assessment team that Amelia was calling out. It's their understanding of events which ultimately will also help shape how we respond to these things. So I think training and being part of these broader conversations is really not only enlightening and helps prevent risk, but I think actually can bring a richer perspective to the broadcast itself. So it's a positive thing as well as a risk mitigation strategy.
Yeah, great. And Amelia, we started with you. We're going to finish with your last comment there, but your sense of what they can do around capacity?
I would absolutely echo what Moira just said. I think there's a lot around scenario planning, but being able to do that in a safe space. A lot of the people I spoke to in security teams clearly felt quite uncomfortable about broaching topics like race with the teams that were traveling. I spoke to one documentary maker who said that for a long time she didn't know how to ask the questions for her team, so they just didn't get asked, and then they weren't reflected, and then they couldn't put the mitigations in place. So having some way of being able to share experiences where people don't feel that they're going to be seen as less competent by raising concerns or worries, perhaps outside the context of an actual event, just as a sort of more general discussion as well. I think also there's much more in terms of vetting, looking up things like the records of public security, just making sure people go in with their eyes open is really important. And then also that partnership working, and that's working in partnership with the security team as well, who are sometimes, again, sort of bolted on at the side rather than fully embedded. And within those discussions, absolutely key not to just do it in one country. Bring in that knowledge and expertise from your local media workers as well, who can really provide the context, that cultural background, that knowledge, so that the scenario planning is an iterative process. And by the time everyone gets there, everyone knows the individual risks everyone in the team may face for different reasons and how to react. And that will put people, I think, in a better position to respond to things as they change.
So just to add a positive note to all of this very risky and dangerous talk, we're actually in the process, along with a number of other civil society organizations, of providing input for the Qatar 2022 grievance mechanism for human rights and other violations. And we're very hopeful that at least the learnings from previous grievance mechanisms can be carried into this process, that the Qatari government and FIFA will actually be hearing us and be able to create a responsive, inclusive, and truly accountable process that can allow journalists to do their work without fear of reprisal. So hopefully we will have a very solid grievance mechanism that actually works.
That's a great way to finish a really interesting session, and thank you for giving us a ray of hope there in the end of that conversation. And thank you so much to all the panelists for your time and your energies and your thoughts. I can hear a sort of virtual round of applause going on in the ether. And to everybody who's out there, I would say a very important thing to remember here is that the Centre for Sport and Human Rights has a lot of work planned. They're doing a lot around supporting broadcasters and journalists and covering events and high-risk areas. So please do get in touch. That is what they're there for. They would love to hear from you to find out more about the work. And of course, there's links on the website. There's links actually on this conference website. So you should be able to find that information. And there's plenty of good conversation going on your chosen social media platform with using the hashtag, which is of course SCF21. And we will be looking forward to welcoming you to the next session, which does begin in 1 hour's time, just a fraction over 1 hour's time. That's 6 o'clock in Central European time. And it's going to be on protecting and safeguarding the well-being of affected persons throughout the remedy process, which in itself will be, yet another really interesting session. And that session is going to look at the sporting community and how they can better safeguard the well-being of affected persons throughout the process, whilst they're, basically sorting out the rights and wrongs, past and present. So thank you very much to everybody who's been involved and who's joined in the conversation. And we will hopefully hear from you online in some form soon. Thanks again.